Nurgle. Infested armies are very tough and resistant infantry, cavalry and monsters, assisted by rotting flyers and some deadly single entities. Nurgle is built to outlast the enemy. In this video, I will show you every unit from the roster before and after research, redline skills and XP. I will also show you the lords and heroes and their abilities in campaign. So your army has the advantages of having great holding infantry. They survive for way too long. Good cavalry, good single entities, good flying units. It could be better in all of these regards, but still it's good units. The disadvantages are you have poor missile choices. You have a few, but not too many. And you do lack good anti-large units, and it's a very, very slow roster overall. So this is a little bit of a disclaimer. There are two red lines, okay? Basically you have one for the heralds, which is the one that I've used for this video. It's the most basic one. And then you have the ones for the Chaos Sorcerer Lords. Now overall, I would still consider the Chaos Sorcerer Lords better. Okay, in overall regard, it gives better types of stats and it gives a little bit better ones in some cases. But note that for the purposes of this video, I've used the previous one, the Herald one. Now, this means that, of course, units can have a variety of different stats overall. Just consider that the Chaos Sorcerer Lords actually give some melee attack, melee defense bases, which means that the units kind of become a little bit better. So just study those and make sure that you select the best choices for whatever army you're trying to build up. So, as an example, here we have the Chaos Warriors of Nurgle. As you can see on the right side, those are the initial stats and then upgraded with the redline skills, research and XP. Note, for instance, that there's none for research. That's because, well, Nurgle doesn't give too many buffs to their own units in terms of research, so sadly that's the case. You'll see that throughout this roster a lot, but that's how it is. So hopefully this implies that you gain a better grasp of how good units become later on into the game, and if you should rush a specific red line or something like that. That's the sort of purpose for this video. As for the first army specific, we have Cloud of Flies. Many of the Nurgle units has this ability. Basically gives +9 melee defense if they are engaged in melee, so adding to the toughness of this army. So many of your units are demonic. This implies that they do have this trait which gives them physical resistance. They don't rout. They are immune to terror. That's all cool, but they do take damage if leadership is very low. So, and this damage is quite significant. They'll get wrecked really fast, so you have to watch out for leadership for your demonic units, otherwise you may lose them in the end of the battle. The third army specific is basically considering the Mark of Nurgle. This affects the mortal units of Nurgle, giving them poison contact effects, increased hit points, increased melee defense, so overall the same idea throughout the roster, survivability, holding on, but it gives them reduced melee attack. Now, this doesn't change anything that is right here, it's already reflected, so always have that in mind. This is just to ensure that you realize what is being changed from different Chaos Warriors, or from the basis Chaos Warriors of, Undivided, basically. In terms of army abilities, you have 3 and they are based on the amount of damage that your units take. So taking damage is actually good for you. And what will you get? We get 3 abilities. The Curse of the Slug, it's a chain hex. Basically you set one target and it will spread out to other enemies, to up to 5 of them, reducing their speed and charge speed. This is great, especially if you use them on enemy cavalry or anything like that, or any units that you're trying to catch up to. Then you have the Fecundity. This is a perfect spell for Nurgle. Chain regeneration. You set up an affected unit and then it will spread out to up to 5 of your units, which is really great. And then you also have the Rot, Glorious Rot. This army ability is causing damage per second, which is always great, and the same idea, it will spread out to other affected units. As always, remember that you have access to these abilities as long as you take damage to your units, so you should be taking damage in order to get this. Starting off with Kugath, Plague Father. It's an extremely powerful lord. tons of hit points, good armor, but very much no shield, slow speed, so those are its limitations. He has great melee attack and great melee defense values, adding magical attacks and poison, which is always nice, and he has excellent weapon strength with melee armor piercing, which is always nice as well. Now, in terms of the best characteristics, it has a very powerful ranged attack. Look at that, 400 range. It acts like an artillery piece for your army. With magical ammunition, still causing poison, still mainly armor piercing, missile damage, so it can wreck enemies from afar really nicely. A very powerful lord to start things up. For Kugath's abilities in campaign, he has Nurgling Infestation, which affects all Nurglings, healing them. He has Slime Trail, which affects enemies in range, reducing melee attack and speed. He also has the Nurgling Tide. This is summoning Nurglings with 3 charges of it. Very good. Then we have the Plague Father's Oration. This ability augments your allies with melee defense and leadership. Very good. He also can get the Fetid Stench. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Fetid Stench gives enemies in range -8 leadership, which is always good to see. And then he also gets the Pestilent Decay, a passive ability. This is a direct damage, similar to what is typically referred to as a Mortis Engine effect. So when Kugath is in melee, it gives direct damage to enemies in range, which is perfect. Now, in terms of the Redline skill, there's some different abilities. The Blight Swarm, which upgrades to the Virulent Contagion. Let me show you the Virulent Contagion. It has 2 uses of this, and it reduces enemy melee defense greatly, spreading up to 5 units. The Herald of Nurgle, a good spellcaster lord with either the Lore of Death or Lore of Nurgle. Decent hit points, not enough armor, no shield, be careful. He does have good melee attack and melee defense values, as well as armor piercing damage, so he can survive on his own a bit compared to other spellcasters. He still causes magical and poison attacks, so it helps, but for the most part you'll want him for his spells and abilities. So in terms of abilities, there's 3 that you can choose from. The Locus of Contagion, it's one, which is a direct damage in an area affecting all enemies, of course, in that area. Then we have the Locus of Fecundity. This heals allies in an area, all allies in range, which is great, and you have 3 charges of it. It also gives vigor per second, which is nice. And then we have the Locus of Virulence, giving armor piercing weapon damage and melee attack to all allies in range. Of course, like mentioned, you have to choose which one to apply. The Chaos Sorcerer Lord of Nurgle comes in 2 variants. Either you can have the one with the Lore of Death or the one with the Lore of Nurgle, as you see here. He is an armored spellcaster. He has decent hit points, good armor there, good melee attack and melee defense values, but instead of armor piercing, it has a normal weapon strength. So basically this is more what we call the typical spellcaster that can survive a bit more than the Herald, basically. Should be noted that he's not demonic, which for a lord is quite important so that he can flee if things go a bit badly for you in battle. As for the abilities of the Chaos Sorcerer Lord of Nurgle, you can get the Locus of Virulence, the augment to allies in range with armor piercing damage and melee attack. Note that it's only armor piercing weapon damage, not weapon damage, okay? Then we have the Decaying Brand, so giving the Paragon of Decay a hex in an area, giving enemies in range a minor reduction to their damage. The Exalted Great Unclean One. This is a spellcaster with a Lore of Death or Lore of Nurgle. It has a substantial amount of hit points, for 12k actually. 14k it's Kugath, this one is 12k. Allowing him to tank nicely, average armor, great melee attack and melee defense values, magical attacks and poison attacks, which is great as well. Weapon strength is great with tons of armor piercing, which is always nice. Overall, this is a better version of the Herald, to be able to assist your forces with magic and still unleash pain and decay in melee. In campaign, the Exalted Great Unclean One can get the passive ability Faded Stench, basically a leadership debuff in an area, very useful. And then we have the Pestilent Decay. This is basically a Mortis Engine effect, a very deadly one, direct damage ability, always perfect to have this when engaging in melee, of course. The Plague Ridden. This is a spellcaster hero with the Lore of Death or the Lore of Nurgle. Good hit points, low armor, no shield, so be careful with that, he's squishy. Fairly decent melee attack and defense values, as well as armor-piercing weapon strength. In essence, he's not quite a melee hero, but he can survive on his own a bit, unlike other typical spellcasters. He does cause magical and poison damage, so he can still be useful under the right circumstances, even in melee. So the Plague Ridden can get either one of three choices. The Locust of Contagion, which is a direct damage in an area, very powerful. Then we have the Locust of Fecundity. A note on this is a regeneration in an area to all allies in range. It doesn't have a limit of the amount of allies you can heal with this. So if everyone is there, he can heal everyone. 3 charges of this, very powerful. And then we have the Locust of Virulence. This is an augment in an area of armor-piercing damage and melee attack. The Exalted Hero of Nurgle, a powerful melee hero, heavily armored, no shield though, be careful, with great melee attack and defense values, definitely good leadership and speed as well. He does cause poison damage, most of his weapon strength is armor piercing, it's a hefty nice amount of it, and he still has a nice charge bonus. So overall, he's great at taking out enemy single entities, lords, heroes. With some support, he'll do really well. So in campaign, the Exalted Hero can get the ability Stand or Die. It's very known, melee defense and leadership affecting allies in range. It's actually useful that a hero can do this, which is excellent. Then we have the Stench Ridden, giving you the ability Locust of Fecundity. We've talked about this one. 3 charges of an area regeneration effect to all allies. He can also get, or actually you need to choose which one, so he can also get instead the Acid Ichor ability. This is a melee damage reflection of +6. It's basically a Thorns effect. If you're familiar with that from Diablo games and such, it's a Thorns effect +6 melee damage reflection. The Cultist of Nurgle, a good melee hero, melee support hero basically. He has a good amount of hit points, not a lot of armor at all, he has no shield so he's squishy, great melee attack and he causes armor sundering, decent melee defense and weapon strength. Those are not his strengths. He can definitely keep up with your forces, but it is in his abilities that he shines. So in terms of his abilities in campaign, the Cultist has regeneration, so weakness to fire, but also heals per second, very good, helping his survivability. Then he also has the Gate of Nurgle. Now these are summoning abilities. This summons Plague Bearers. If the hit points are less than 75%, he starts to recharge. It takes some time to recharge, and then you can use this. And then you have the Greater Gate of Nurgle. This is also used to summon one unit, one charge of a Great Unclean One, very powerful, and if it only recharges if the hit points are less than 50%. So take damage and then you can use it. Nurglings. These happy little fellas here, they're very much a very solid frontline unit in the beginning, especially because they do have a lot of hit points. They don't have any armor whatsoever, which is kind of the big problem. But they do have decent melee attack and melee defense, and especially weapon strength, actually, for, you know, a starter unit. Note that it doesn't have as much armor-piercing weapon damage as, let's say, a tier 1 unit, but it does cause magical attacks and poison. Always remember that these are demonic, so they do have physical resistance, and they still have that cloud of flies, and they have vanguard deployment. So overall, very useful. Now in the late game, you can, because of the mechanics of Nurgle, you'll most likely have some Nurglings, but it's important for you to realize how much better they actually become, to the point that they are quite fast, which is good for Nurgle. And you still get a little bit more leadership, more armor, some armor, whatever, some more melee attack and melee defense, and you always have to count on that physical resistance and that cloud of flies to ensure that they do hold up nicely. So together with some other buffs or some regeneration, they can definitely hold the line up into the mid-game. And now for Regiment of Renown, the Frolickers Bubonic, Nurglings Regiment of Renown. So basically, same unit as the Nurglings, just improved stats, as you can see, but it has one small advantage with this ability. This is a passive ability when they are in melee, melee damage reflection, +10. How much does that actually imply? It's unclear, but they do have melee damage reflection, up to you to test it out, and some more leadership, which is excellent, because as you've seen how it works in terms of demonic, the more leadership the better. They won't rout as quickly, or actually they won't dissolve as quickly or get banished as quickly, so that's very important. A very useful early game unit. Marauders of Nurgle. These are basically an early game frontline unit. They do have a bronze shield, that's their main idea. They're good against enemies with some missile firepower. They have tons of hit points. This is a staple in Nurgle armies. I won't mention this all the time. Just be wary that most of these units actually have a lot of hit points, which is great. And that's mainly due to the mark of Nurgle. So, because they do have increased hit points, melee defense, reduced melee attack, and poison contact defense. So, precisely, they do have decent melee attack actually and great melee defense, and the weapon strength, it's nice, especially for an early game unit. Now in the late game, as you can see there, you can still field a couple of these guys. They won't get crazy stats or anything, but they definitely reach out to a tier 2 sort of unit, you know, with 40 melee attack and 40s melee defense, actually reaching up to the nearly 50s, which is great, but definitely they are no longer, you know, they won't get into a damage dealer anytime soon. All that they are worth for is to soak up those missiles, soak up that damage, so that others can cause the most damage. Marauders of Nurgle with great weapons. The main difference from these guys to the others is that they lose that shield and a little bit of the melee defense, so they're better in the offense, and especially they do have armor piercing. Still, with the mark of Nurgle, remember that they are a little bit more tanky than others, which is great, especially for a damage dealer. They still cause a lot of damage and they survive a little bit more because of those hit points. Always have that in mind. Especially in the late game, you may be able to field a couple of these units. They definitely have the damage to justify it. And in particular, it's always important to reflect that speed addition, because Nurgle has issues with speed, so sometimes you want something quicker to be able to, you know, accommodate to your needs. They do get a little bit of missile resistance, as you can see there, a little bit more armor, melee attack and melee defense, that's a given, but definitely they don't leave out the tier 1, tier 2 sort of unit, so always remember that you have, of course, better options. Plague Bearers of Nurgle. Tons of hit points on this unit, which is always great. These are very much exactly what it says on the unit card. A tier 2 unit. Not a lot of armor, not a lot of speed. They're very, very, very slow. That's the main issue here. They do have decent melee attack and melee defense values with magical attacks and poison, so that's great. Their weapon strength is actually quite good. Very much. They don't have, you know, a focus on armor piercing, but they have enough to put the hurt on any unit. Always remember they are demonic, so they do have that physical resistance, they do have the causing fear, they're immune to terror, and they do have that cloud of flies, so that melee defense when in combat increases, which is always nice. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these units. Of course, you'll have better options, but always note that you'll have some ward save, some more missile resistance, so all of those together combined give them a little bit more of that tankiness, and they still get a little bit more melee attack and melee defense in order to survive against greater foes, but of course you'll have better options. It's up to you and to use them properly in the early to mid game, maybe in the late game if you're in a rush, that sort of idea. It's always important that you note what you're getting into. The Forsaken of Nurgle, very much a damage dealer in the army of Nurgle. They do have some nice armor compared to the others, which is great, and they do have Frenzy, which is why you see all these increased stats over here. The main addition is that they are kind of outside of what typically a Nurgle unit is, because they do have a good speed, good melee attack. They're pretty much a very good damage dealer. That armor piercing weapon damage, it's not basically armor piercing, but they do have enough of it to justify it, and they have a nice charge bonus. So compared to others, always ensure that you do charge them in. Now in the late game, of course, you're gonna field different units, but you should always remember that it may be useful for you to get a couple of these units just because of their speed. It's up to you. They do get increased stats all around, especially in the armor reaching nearly 100, which is always nice. That speed is really cool. Melee attack, melee defense, and a little bit of missile resistance. Just note, of course, you'll have better options, but always remember that you may have to rely on these for quite a bit, especially early to mid game. Now to a regiment of renown, the Demon Spew. This is pretty much the same as the Forsaken of Nurgle. However, they do have, beyond the Frenzy, they do have this ability, the Swarm of Flies, affecting enemies in range with a minus melee attack of -5. So this is useful if you add up to the poison already. This means that the enemy will be severely diminished as well, so it's great. It will ensure that your tankiness keeps being the strong point because they won't cause as much damage, and they're very much a very good frontline unit to have in an army to ensure that that debuff goes into the most enemies possible, and that your other units, of course, benefit from it as well. A very nice ROR unit to have in whatever army you choose. If you're looking for a very solid front line, look no further to the Chaos Warriors of Nurgle. Heavily armored and shielded. This is a silver shield, so goodbye missiles. That's very cool. They don't have a lot of speed, which is a big problem. Melee attack and melee defense values are great, actually very good for what you want in a frontline unit. They'll survive really well. Their weapon strength is not majorly armor piercing, that's the weakness. It doesn't cause too much damage, but they do still have that poison, as many other units, of course, in the Nurgle roster. Now, in terms of the late game, you can definitely field a couple of more of these units. They don't benefit too much from, research or redline, but still enough. Good spell resistance, good missile resistance, so for the enemy to take them out without being in melee, it's going to be a little bit more tougher for that, and they still get good melee attack and melee defense values, reaching 66 in terms of melee defense in the late game if you wish, so justifying perhaps your initial recruitment cost for these units for sure, and the upkeep for them. Of course, you will have better units overall, but still you can rely on these guys to hold the line for quite some time. Chaos Warriors of Nurgle with great weapons come next. Now the main difference, of course, is they lose that shield. They still have that nice armor, but they gain armor piercing weapon damage, which basically that's the sole purpose of these guys, to cleave through the enemies, and they'll do that just nicely, really well nice. They don't have a lot of speed, so ensure that the enemy is slowed down, perhaps precisely with that use of the poison with other units. Do charge them in so that you can get that nice charge bonus. It's really useful. And yep, good melee defense values and decent melee attack. Of course, it could be better in terms of melee attack, but that's how Nurgle works. In the late game, you can definitely use a couple of these guys, especially. They will be rather cheap versions of, instead of having the Chosen, you can have these guys, and definitely they'll cleave through most enemies with ease. Now, they do get a little bit more melee attack, which is nice, better melee defense, so they can still survive in prolonged melee, and they'll put the hurt on any armored opponent. The Exalted Plague Bearers of Nurgle. They have quite a nice change from the previous Plague Bearers. First of all, they do have even more hit points, 13k. It's really a lot for any infantry unit. Not a lot of armor still, very much a slow unit. Good melee attack and melee defense values with definitely much better weapon strength. It's not majorly armor piercing, but they do have magical attacks, poison, which is always nice. Main difference from these guys is that they do have 3 magical ammunition volleys. Not a lot of range, but these basically are just some missiles to use before engaging in melee. And these are armor-piercing missiles, which is really nice. They also cause poison, so the enemy will be affected by poison really well. And they still have that cloud of flies, they still have that physical resistance. Overall, a very tanky unit, but still causing damage. In the late game, as you can see there, you can definitely use a couple of these guys. They'll improve some of the stats really nicely, such as gaining a little bit more armor, surviving a little bit more, of course, but that melee attack and melee defense, they'll reach the 50s, which is always nice. That means that they will do a lot of damage and still tank, which is always a staple of Nurgle. They just survive for so long, especially with those increased melee defense values and armor. It's amazing how much they actually survive, which is great. This means that you can go into the demonic side of things if you wish for a front line with these, basically even well into the late game. Just be watching out for against enemies with a lot of missiles, because that's their main weakness. And time for a Regiment of Renown, the Festering Stooges, the Exalted Plague Bearers Regiment of Renown. So overall, improved stats, really good into the 50s in terms of melee defense and weapon strength here, and almost 50 in melee attack, which is always nice. Main differences here, some abilities. First, they have Gloom of Flies. When they are in melee, they have the melee defense +9 and they can cause terror. So it's better than the Cloud of Flies. It's a little bit better because it causes terror, which is great. And in addition, they also have the Festering Gate. When they are in melee, they replenish and they resurrect dead combatants. Sometimes it's very important to note if a replenishment has that, because this one has, which means that they are incredibly tanky. Good luck to the enemy of getting rid of these guys. Very useful infantry unit to be in the front line, in the middle of the front line. That's where I would put them, but they'll do a good job anyways elsewhere. So yeah, very nice addition to the Nurgle roster. But if you're looking for the ultimate front line for Nurgle, the Chosen are your choice. Heavily armored with the Silver Shield, so they're just even better than the Chaos Warriors of Nurgle in this regard. A little bit more armor there. Tons of hit points, which is really important. They have a lot of melee attack and great melee defense, some of the tankiest units in the game. Weapon strength, it's kind of like their weak point. It's not mainly armor piercing, even though that axe really would shine in real life, but okay, it's not mainly armor piercing. It has decent values, so they can cleave through those enemies. It just takes a little bit longer. If you can, always engage with the charge bonus, which is always nice, especially for these types of units. Of course, it may be more useful for you to hold, but it's up to you. Now, in terms of the late game, definitely bring up some of these guys. They'll always be a very good holding infantry, even more armor and more melee defense, reaching the 80s in terms of value. So yeah, if you reach the 80s in anything, it's really a tanky unit. So overall, a very nice addition to any Nurgle army. And if you want the ultimate killing machine in terms of infantry for Nurgle, the Chosen of Nurgle with great weapons. These guys survive against anything, really. Honestly, you can put them against anything, a single entity, enemy infantry, anything at all, they'll cleave through it and they'll survive it. It's very difficult to get rid of these guys, so just bring them a little bit in your armies and you'll see the difference. So they cause poison, they do have tons of armor, no shield, which is a little bit of their weakness, so be wary of enemy missile units, so anti-shield units, that's what I was about to say. Good melee attack and melee defense values, which is important for a great weapons unit. It has a lot of melee defense, which is great, and their weapon strength, of course, it's mainly armor piercing, with a ton of it as well. They do have good charge bonus, so ensure that you do charge these guys in to cause maximum damage. In the late game, as you can see there, they do get tons more the benefits, actually, in terms of the armor, the melee attack and melee defense, as if they would need even more melee attack and melee defense, but, well, they get it. And still a little bit of ward save, a little bit of missile resistance, a little bit of spell resistance. All of that adds up to make sure that this unit stays there and causes the damage that you need. The Chaos Chariots of Nurgle. So here's something interesting about the fact that we have a Chaos Chariot of Nurgle. So because they do get that high melee defense, and that's basically typically the weakness of a chariot unit, these guys may be still viable, especially early to mid game. Whenever you manage to get them, try them out, they'll do some damage. They do have great armor, so that's a good given. They do have poison attacks, so the enemy won't be causing as much damage to them, and they still have that nice melee defense. The weapon strength is not majority armor piercing, that's a big iffy, but they do get that bonus versus infantry, so they're great at charging in the backs of enemy infantry and just cleaving through those guys. A good charge bonus and decent speed, that's precisely what you should be doing with these guys. In the late game, they get some improved stats over there, and especially special attention to the melee defense, because it reaches into the 50s, which for a chariot is really important. That's precisely the main typical weakness of a chariot, so I would be very interested in trying out some of these chariots, especially in the early to mid game, just to see how well they would perform. And it's very good, especially if you don't have a lot of micro, if you're focused more into trying to watch the battles. Try these guys out, they may surprise you as well. Hopefully the melee attack is not hindering them too much, but since you'll be most of the time charging, that should be taken care of. Now to one of the coolest looking units in the game, the Chaos Knights of Nurgle. So, armor then shielded, which is very important. They do survive quite a lot. They do have a nice speed, which is great. It's always important. Melee attack with poison damage, that's always nice. And great melee defense. So these guys are very much in all their stats a melee cavalry. You can send these guys in and leave them there, which is great if you don't have a lot of micro. Nurgle is kind of like a good faction for that. If you just want to focus on your single entities and you know, just issue one attack order and that's it, these guys are really cool. Especially they do have nice charge bonus, so make sure that you charge them. That weapon strength is not mainly armor piercing, but it will cause the hurt to anyone. In the late game you can definitely field a lot of these guys in your armies, or just combinations of between Chosen and Chaos Knights is always useful. They do get a little bit more speed, more charge bonus, not a lot of it, but still it's important. Some ward save and some physical resistance, which adds up, you know, to ensure that they do get a little bit more tankiness, and they still get even better melee defense. So overall you can send these guys in, they'll survive, they'll do the damage through time. That's precisely playing into the play style of Nurgle, so it's why I like these units so much. And if you want a more focused on the charge unit, the Chaos Knights of Nurgle with lances. Overall the same unit with good armor and the shield still. They still have good melee attack, lower melee defense, but still high by any means. And then the weapon strength is still the same, good armor piercing damage there, but still mostly base weapon damage. The charge bonus is where it gets better. So a lot of charge bonus. These units are very cool to do the hammer and anvil tactic. Just charge them in the flanks or the rear of the enemy, and they are exactly what it says on the title, a shock cavalry. Now in the late game they actually kind of become like more of a melee cavalry with those values. Great armor, good leadership, good speed, good melee attack and melee defense values into the 60 melee defense, which is always nice, especially for a shock cavalry. So overall, like I've been saying, if you don't have a lot of micro and if you just want to charge them in once, by all means, these guys will definitely rip through some enemies if you get the charge nicely, and then you can focus on healing them with your heroes or lords, which is perfect. And to add to that, the ward save and the physical resistance is always nice to ensure that they can survive while you're healing them up and they're doing the damage over time. One of the few missile units of Nurgle, the Marauder Horsemen of Nurgle, they're very good. They do have a shield, which means that they do survive against counter missiles, which is great. Not a lot in terms of melee attack, but they do cause poison, which is great. Good melee defense, so if the enemy catches up to them, they still will survive a little bit. The main idea, of course, is they don't have a lot of ammunition, not a lot of range, but the missile is armor piercing. That's the main focus of these guys. It still causes poison, which is great. It means that the enemy that tries to chase them off is going to be slowed down, it's going to take some damage, which is always nice. It's always very good when you have a unit that can kind of defend itself or run away from danger if needed. They do have Vanguard deployment and they fire whilst moving, which is perfect for that hit and run tactic. In the late game you can field a couple of these guys, especially useful if the enemy has some powerful flyers, for instance. They can poison them, they can make sure that they don't cause a lot of damage, they can run away from them into your infantry and cause all sorts of havoc. Just be wary of enemy fast units, or of course any missile units that can dish out a lot of damage to them, because they are kind of squishy. Especially for a Nurgle unit, you may be wondering if they are going to survive. Not a lot. They survive a little bit better than a Marauder Horseman, but don't count on them surviving for too long. The Chaos Warhounds of Nurgle, they actually are the poison variant, of course, as you would expect. These are very much your typical hounds, very fast on their feet, which is great for Nurgle. They do cause poison, not a lot in terms of stats, armor, very weak melee attack and melee defense. They do have decent weapon strength for what you're going to be using them. Chasing off skirmishes, going after enemy artillery, missiles. They do have Vanguard deployment and Strider, and some nice missile resistance, so they're very good at it. Now, in terms of the late game, or after all the buffs, they just become a little bit better at their job, mainly getting a little bit more speed, some physical resistance, so definitely you can use these guys to chase off some enemy artillery and make use of that Vanguard, but of course you'll have better units overall. This is just to illustrate how good the unit actually becomes. The Chaos Furies of Nurgle. These units, don't neglect them, especially early game. They may prove just as useful and exactly what you need. So they do have some mixed stats here. They're very fast. They don't look like a Nurgle unit at all. They're very fast. They don't have a lot of armor, not a lot of HP here. They do have good melee attack and poor melee defense. Decent weapon strength. Note that they do cause magical attacks and poison, which is always nice. They still have nice charge bonus. They have Vanguard deployment, which is nice. Of course, they're flyers. They're used as any flyer unit to get a hold of enemy flyers or to wreck enemy artillery or missiles or just harass the enemy. They have good physical resistance and the Cloud of Flies, so they have a little bit better melee defense there. So overall, these guys are very much a damage dealer from above. That's precisely how you should use them. If there's an enemy target that you need to get rid of quickly, send him some Furies. They will do the trick, especially early to mid game, of course. Now, after all the updates, they do get much better weapon strength, a little bit of missile resistance, which is nice, even more armor piercing weapon damage, which is very important, and even better melee attack. So their weaknesses are still there. Weak melee defense, weak armor, they're still there, but they become much better at their job of dealing damage fast to whatever target you need for them. So sometimes a couple of Chaos Furies may be worth to have in your armies, especially against high value targets. And next we have some toads. Basically a big mouth with some big horns and a nice eye. Hey, I didn't mean to insult you. You're fine. You're cute. So the Plague Toads of Nurgle, these were improved. Now they are armor-piercing units. So basically, decent hit points, decent armor. Well, it's pretty much average, really. Not a lot of leadership, so note that they are demonic, so be careful with that leadership. That's a very nice weakness of them. Decent speed, so overall they're kind of average in everything. Good melee attack, low melee defense, so they're better in offense, and they cause armor piercing. Note that this is not the typical armor piercing, it's half-half. Typically it's like a 1/3, 2/3 ratio, but in this case it's half-half, and they do get some bonuses versus infantry. Always ensure that you get that nice charge bonus. Remember that they do have that Cloud of Flies, so they get a little bit more melee defense when in melee, and yeah, that's about it. In the late game you can definitely field a couple of these guys. They get much better stats. In terms of speed, they become pretty much a good monstrous cavalry sort of a unit, which is nice, and some more survivability. Better melee defense, which is great. They'll just become more tanky, even better physical resistance. It's nice. Just make sure that they are not fighting anything with magical attacks, for instance, and they still get a little bit of a bonus versus large, which is interesting. They will have it's one of the few units that will have both the bonuses versus infantry and a bonuses versus large in the roster, so that's great. Overall, a very nice addition to your forces. Of course, you may wish to have better units, but that's exactly your decision. If you wish to use the Plague Toads, now you know how better they can become. Now to the Beast of Nurgle, a very nice single entity, so overall it has good hit points, decent armor, nothing too shabby, low leadership, so be careful with this. You know, it's a single entity, that leadership, and being demonic, be careful with that. Not a lot in terms of speed, good melee attack and melee defense values with magical attacks, with poison, most of the units of course have the poison, and the armor piercing weapon strength, which is always cool. Overall, this would already be a nice single entity, a mid-tier single entity, but they then have the regeneration, They still have the Cloud of Flies, and they have the Slime Trail, a nice passive ability that reduces enemies' melee attack and speed, which is always nice to have. So overall, a very good tanky single entity that can still cause some damage. Overall, a very good early game unit to use against large units, for instance. Just be careful with those anti-large enemies. And missiles, of course, she's kind of weak. Now, in the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these units. Of course, you'll have better options, but you can definitely use a couple of them. They get better stats overall, especially some more spell resistances, some more resistance, missile, physical, spell resistance, which is always nice, more leadership, which is important, good melee attack and melee defense value. So overall, you can still use a couple of these guys if you need, or if you just have them. You know, Nurgle is different in terms of recruitment, so you may have just a couple to recruit and you'll benefit from those. Now to yet another flying unit, the Rot Flies. Basically good hit points, decent armor, you know, it's average. Of course, most flyers don't have a lot of armor anyways, but still. Good speed, the melee attack is decent, melee defense could be better, of course. It's still, they cause magical attacks and poison, as many units do in the Nurgle roster. Main advantage is that they have an armor-piercing weapon strength, so they're very good at dishing out damage, especially against heavily armored opponents. Mostly good at clearing up the skies, so that's something that Nurgle can actually do really well, clearing up the skies and then issuing some damage from above, you know, some tactical solutions from above. They don't have a lot of charge bonus, which is kind of bad. It's kind of silly, of course. They could have a little bit more charge bonus, but, well, that's how they are designed. In the late game, you can still field a couple of these units. Of course, they may be very much obsolete by plague drones later on. I'll talk about them. But they do get some ward save, some missile resistance, they adding to that physical resistance, and a little bit more melee attack and weapon strength, which means that they'll always be sort of like a glass cannon unit, but yeah, that's mainly their purpose, to go in, dish out some damage, especially armor-piercing damage on an unforeseen enemy. An upgrade to the Toads are the Pox Riders of Nurgle. Still average armor and average speed overall. You know, they're not as fast as other cavalry units, which is mainly their purpose. They do have decent melee attack and melee defense values. Magical attacks and poison, of course, always useful. Their weapon strength is mainly armor piercing. Note that this is just half-half, really. So it's not a 2/3, 1/3 ratio, as always. And they have a bonus versus infantry. A good charge bonus, and you already know the effect of this unit. Useful for charging in, doing some damage, especially to enemy armored infantry, but don't leave them in prolonged combat for too long because they can be rather squishy. They still have that melee defense from the Cloud of Flies while in melee, the physical resistance, it's always nice. Keep an eye out on the leadership, which is a problem. Now in the late game you can definitely use a couple of these guys. They'll get more physical resistance, more melee defense, lots of it, up into the 56, which is good, more armor, and definitely one good improvement is the speed. Because they improve the speed, they suddenly become much better at their intended use, which is just to, you know, chase enemies around or move around, clean up the flanks, and then going for a hammer and anvil, and for that you'll always benefit from better speed and charge bonus. Adding to this, they do get that bonuses versus large, which makes them kind of like a hybrid. They'll be good against other large targets and infantry units, otherwise a little bit squishy, but of course you'll have some regeneration to help them out. And now to Regiment of Renown, the Barons of the Bog. Pox Riders of Nurgle, Regiment of Renown, much better armor over there, decent leadership, improved stats altogether, still the same speed, lower speed, still the same purpose. Their weapon strength is still half and half, base weapon damage and armor piercing, so they're good against most targets. So the advantages here, they do have the Miasma of Rot. This passive ability affects allies in rage, giving them vigor if their hit points are less than 50%. Still nice, not the most important one, but vigor is still quite much an important stat. And then we have the Wasting Sickness. So this affects enemies reducing their mass, which is excellent. Sometimes this implies that the enemy will do some poor decisions into where they will advance, and always that base weapon damage and armor piercing weapon damage reduction is always nice. So overall, notice that this effect range is pretty cool, and the mass is minus 25%. That's very helpful. So especially against single entities or large entities which rely on that mass, these guys kind of negate that, which is always excellent. A very nice addition to your roster. Now a unit that exists all throughout Chaos, the Spawn. In this case, the Spawn of Nurgle. It's pretty much a damage dealer anti-infantry unit, low armor, perfect leadership because it does have that unbreakable trait, which is excellent. This is their main usage. They are quite fast, which is excellent. You always need some fast units in the Nurgle roster. A good average melee attack and melee defense, let's call it out. Weapon strength is not mainly armor piercing, so it's very good, but still doesn't have a lot of armor piercing. It's just great weapon strength overall. Do note that they always have that cloud of flies, so in terms of melee defense, it's much better when they are engaged in melee. Now, in the late game, you can still field a couple of these guys, especially with some support, with some heal. They'll do nicely. They do get a little bit more tankiness with melee defense, armor, and that physical resistance, but don't expect them to cause any more damage than they already do in the beginning, because nothing gets really improved in that regard. Not a lot of melee attack improvements, just from the XP. Overall, a good unit, but could be a little bit more focused into the damage dealing aspect, but still, they're tanky, they'll survive. That's the main usage that you're gonna give him. Now to the Plague Drones of Nurgle. A very nice flying war beast, basically. Average armor, good speed, average melee attack and melee defense with magical attacks and poison, which is always nice. The weapon strength is pretty much armor piercing, very nice armor piercing weapon damage. That's precisely what you're going to use these guys for. To dish out damage from above, maybe clear up the skies, which is always nice, especially because they do have that physical resistance, they do have that cloud of flies, so they'll survive longer and they'll do a lot of hurt to enemy flying units or even single entities, really. Especially in the late game, where they get better improved stats in terms of melee attack and in terms of weapon strength, which is excellent. The weapon strength reaches like monstrous infantry size, which is pretty cool. They do also have some ward save, some missile resist, but always note that they are quite weak against missiles still, so be careful. If the enemy is fielding a lot of missile units, maybe you want to take care of them before engaging with these guys. Still, very much a very good late game unit for Nurgle. The Chaos War Shrine of Nurgle, it's very much a very cool addition to the roster. This single entity has tons of hit points, good armor, decent leadership to survive, decent speed, decent melee attack and melee defense. It's pretty much average everything. It still causes poison attacks, no magical attacks, by the way. Decent weapon strength. It's not going to take down enemy single entities by itself. That's not the main purpose. Main purpose, what is it? It's the abilities. It has the Giver of Abundant Glory. This heals enemy allies in range, heals enemies with each nearby entity death. So you pop this guy up near wherever the enemy is losing entities, and it's great. It will start healing up your forces, so having a couple of them together with your front line will do a lot of good work for you. And it also has the favor of the ruinous powers, augmenting their leadership, which is very important, especially for demonic units, to avoid them getting banished and having all that damage reduction. So it's really cool, and it's a leadership plus 10. It's really important to have this. Overall, in the late game, they'll still just become better at their job. They'll survive a little bit more with increased melee defense, with increased armor and some missile resistance. So overall, you can definitely field a couple of these units to ensure that your forces can benefit from that heal and from that leadership. The Great Unclean one of the best single entities here for Nurgle, pretty much, because it does have tons of hit points, not a lot of armor. It's kind of weak to missiles, for instance, because it doesn't have any shield or armor, really. It does have great melee attack and melee defense values, magical attacks and poison, always a given. Great weapon strength, which is mainly armor piercing, so it's very good against enemy single entities. Overall, that's the main purpose that you'll send this guy in for. Now, One note, it still has the Cloud of Flies, so that melee defense increases while it is in melee. It has 2 charges of 2 different spells, so 1 charge of actually each spell. Stream of Corruption, which is a nice breath attack spell, really. It's pretty cool. It does a lot of armor piercing and magical damage. Pretty good against enemy units overall, and causes poison in contact, as if you need. Everyone causes poison here. And then we have the Miasma of Pestilence. This is great to negate the melee attack and charge bonus of the enemy, especially good against an enemy single entity that is charging in. You just use the Miasma and your Great Unclean One can do a great work against it. Especially in the late game, you can definitely feel these guys. Good spell resistance and missile resistance additions, a little bit more armor, which is always important, and pretty much what you should expect. More leadership, melee attack and melee defense, making sure that it survives for longer, that it attacks, and it's very effective with its attacks. All that you can hope for. So definitely bring up a couple of these guys in each army and you'll do great. And now to a Regiment of Renown, Uncle Furuncle. I love the name. So still pretty much your Great Unclean One, all the improved stats, you know, the decent hit point count, not a lot of armor, decent speed, let's say, for a single entity, good melee attack and melee defense values, still weapon strength, mainly armor piercing. What are the changes? Beyond the Stream of Corruption, which it has still 1 use, same spell, it has the Spirit Leech, which is great. This is especially useful against single entities, which is awesome. It's awesome that it has. It doesn't have a lot of range, contrary to how the Spirit Leech can reach in when it's from a spellcaster, but still 100 meters, still nice. It can be useful against single entities. And then it has the Defiling Deluge. This is also a direct damage in an area which heals him, and it causes damage, of course, to the enemy, which is great. So it affects enemies in range and affects allies in range, so it can heal 1, which is great. So a very good, it has 2 charges, a very good damage spell that can also heal. Perfect for exactly what you want. This guy is very cool at taking out enemy single entities. Just ensure that you keep an eye on it, especially on the leadership, because it's still demonic. It can still vanish if you're not careful, if that leadership becomes too low. And now to an interesting Regiment of Renown, the Bilious Thunderguff, a Chaos Giant. Overall, you don't have access to giants in your army, but you can field 1 of them. Typically your other giants, but with even better hit points, because it does have that mark of Nurgle. So overall, this is really important. It causes poison, and it has good melee attack and melee defense values, which typically doesn't happen. Typically it only goes into the melee attack, but this has been changed because, of course, it has increased melee defense and reduced melee attack. It still has definitely a lot of melee attack and melee defense values. Great weapon strength. This is a single entity killer, really. Now, it does have a nice ability, which is a Vortex ability. This causes a corroded armor, so it reduces the enemy armor, which is great. Affects up to 5 units in range, and it does some damage per second, but overall this is great to diminish the enemy armor so that your other units around can take care of enemies that are affected by it. Overall, a very nice single entity to have in your forces. Time for the Plague Drones of Nurgle with Death's Heads. Basically, their main advantage is that they do have a ranged weapon. 10 ammunition is not that great, but it's still very useful, and the missile strength causes poison, and it's mainly armor piercing. So these guys are really great at dishing damage from above, which is excellent. You do need some special range units, so that's great for Nurgle. And they do have the Vanguard, the Fire Whilst Moving, sorry, not Vanguard. Fire whilst moving, which is great, especially for this kind of unit. It's fast, it can outrun the enemy, can shoot at them, go back, shoot at them. It's really cool, and it can still engage in melee with those stats. Melee attack, melee defense, and weapon strength. It's perfect. That's exactly what you want from this kind of unit. A very good hit-and-run based unit. And in the late game, you can definitely field a couple of these guys. They get better melee stats, overall becoming kind of like a glass cannon from above, really. That's how I like to describe it. Good melee attack and melee defense values and weapon strength. They don't get anything for their missile attack, but it's still very much a very a good one, you know, because of all that armor piercing damage, and they still get some ward save, some missile resistance added to that physical resistance. Overall, one of the better units that I like to use, especially if you want to snipe specific targets. These guys are perfect to snipe anything that the enemy has that cannot shoot them in return. The Soul Grinder of Nurgle. This is a missile monster. One of the better units here. It can definitely be a late game unit because it's basically an artillery unit. Has 360 range, which is excellent. 15 ammunition is definitely good to cause some damage to the enemy, and they're still good in combat. Good hit points, good armor, decent melee attack and melee defense values, armor piercing weapon strength, and armor piercing damage missile, which is great. It still has that cloud of flies, so you can survive a little bit more when in melee. Overall, a very nice addition to your roster, especially in the late game, when it gets even better because of that ammunition. It gets 100% more ammunition, 30, then it becomes a really powerful artillery unit that the enemy can't get rid of really fast because they are good in combat as well. And they'll get into the 50s in terms of melee attack and melee defense, always excellent. Main weakness, perhaps anything that is dedicated anti-large or that has a lot of armor-piercing missiles, for instance, that's their dangers, but still they do get much better overall stats in the late game, enough to justify bringing maybe a couple of them, maybe 3, maybe 4 if you wish, depends on how you're going to do your battles, of course, but overall, very nice addition to the roster. And there you go, that's all the units so far for Nurgle, before and after Redline skills, research and XP. I hope that you enjoyed this video and it helps you build different compositions and just enjoy the game a little bit better. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.